Before we get started, make sure to subscribe to the channel and like this video. That way, you'll always stay connected to our stories and never miss the next adventure. In the grand, sweeping expanse of known space, there existed a military alliance so powerful, so utterly dominant, that the mere mention of their name caused entire civilizations to reconsider their life choices. They called themselves the Galactic Apex Coalition, which was either incredibly arrogant or just honest advertising, depending on who you asked. 8 species of apex predators, each one the undisputed king of their respective food chains, had banded together 3,000 rotations ago with a simple philosophy. Why fight each other when you could divide the galaxy like a particularly aggressive pizza? The Mthros, massive insectoid warriors with serrated mandibles that could shear through reinforced titanium. The Norgdal, amphibious behemoths whose skin secreted a paralytic toxin strong enough to down a transport shuttle. The Krill, avian hunters with talons like monomolecular blades and eyesight that could spot a ship's heat signature from 3-star systems away. And 5 other equally terrifying species, each one bringing their own unique brand of evolutionary superiority to the table. Together, they had never, not once in 3 millennia, lost a territorial dispute. Not a single one. Their record was so perfect, it was almost boring, really. Almost. Commander Gralmos of the Mthros stood on the bridge of his flagship, the inexorable Mandate, watching the view screen with the kind of casual confidence that came from knowing you were, biologically speaking, designed to win. His chitinous exoskeleton gleamed under the ship's lighting, iridescent greens and blacks shifting as he moved. At nearly 3 meters tall, with 4 arms ending in blade-tipped fingers, and compound eyes that processed information faster than most species' computers, he was the very picture of predatory evolution at its finest. Status, he clicked, his mandibles creating the characteristic percussion of Mthros speech that the universal translator smoothed into something other species could understand. The human vessel remains stationary at the edge of the Outer Marrow Nebula, Commander, replied his tactical officer, a younger Mthros named Threshnik. They have not powered weapons or attempted to flee. Sensors indicate a crew complement of 32 biologicals. Gralmos allowed himself what his species considered a smile, though most other races would have found the display of serrated mandibles absolutely horrifying. 32. Against his fleet of 5 warships carrying over 2,000 coalition warriors. The humans had to know they were outmatched. This would be another swift, clean acquisition for the coalition. The Outer Marrow Nebula was rich in rare elements, and the coalition had already filed the proper territorial claims with the Galactic Registry. The fact that these humans had showed up 3 cycles later, claiming they'd filed first, was merely an administrative inconvenience. Hail them, Gralmos ordered. Let us resolve this matter quickly. I have a commendation ceremony in 6 rotations. The view screen shifted, and Gralmos found himself looking at a human for the first time in his military career. The creature was, to put it mildly, underwhelming. Soft skin with no natural armor, no visible claws or fangs, binocular vision that was frankly adorable in its limitations, and a body structure that looked like it would collapse under anything more than standard gravity. The human was male, if Gralmos's briefing materials were correct, with hair the color of rust and eyes that were an unsettling shade of green. But what struck Gralmos most was the expression on the human's face. Not fear, which would have been appropriate. Not even defiance, which would have been respectable. No, the human looked tired, mildly inconvenienced, like someone had interrupted his recreational period to discuss the least interesting topic imaginable. "I am Commander Gralmos of the Galactic Apex Coalition," he announced, letting his full height dominate the screen. "You are in violation of Coalition territorial claims. You will vacate this system immediately or face military consequences." The human stared at him for a long moment, then glanced off-screen at something. There was a pause, long enough to be uncomfortable, before the human looked back. "Yeah, hi," the human said, his voice carrying the kind of flat affect that suggested he was reading from the galaxy's most boring script. "I'm Captain Donovan of the exploration vessel Wandering Oak. We filed territorial claims on the Outer Marrow Nebula 6 months ago, standard galactic registry time. So, with all due respect, Commander, you're actually in violation of our claim." Gralmos felt his auxiliary combat arms twitch in surprise. Was this creature actually arguing with him? "Our records indicate Coalition filing occurred first. Provide proof of your claim or surrender this system." "Sure, I can provide proof," Donovan said, still maintaining that bizarrely casual tone. "But here's the thing, Commander. I'm going to need about 30 minutes before we can do any kind of productive negotiating." 30 minutes? Gralmos's compound eyes processed this information with mounting confusion. "Explain," he demanded. "My crew needs to prepare properly for this conversation," Donovan said, and was that amusement in his voice? "We'll be ready to talk in 30 minutes. Wandering Oak out." The screen went dark before Gralmos could respond. Silence filled the bridge of the inexorable mandate for exactly 3 of the human's seconds, which Gralmos knew because his threat assessment training included detailed studies of how long it took various species to process unexpected situations. Did that soft skin just dismiss us?" Threshnik asked, his vocal clicks rising in pitch with confusion. "Activate surveillance sensors," Gralmos ordered, his tactical mind already adapting to this unexpected development. "I want to know what they are preparing. If they are powering weapons, we strike immediately." What appeared on the tactical display over the next several minutes was, without question, the strangest pre-combat preparation Gralmos had ever witnessed. And he had seen the Krill's blood feather ceremony, which involved ritualistic self-mutilation and screaming at the void of space, so the bar was already quite high. The humans were grinding seeds. Dark, small seeds that they crushed into powder with what appeared to be specialized machinery. Then they boiled water, plain water, to specific temperatures that their sensors carefully monitored. They mixed the ground seeds with the hot water and waited while the mixture steeped. And then, most bizarrely, they stood over their containers, closed their eyes, and inhaled the aromatic steam with expressions of what could only be described as religious reverence. "What in the name of the first hive are they doing?" Threshnik whispered, his usual military composure cracking. Gralmos watched, fascinated despite himself. He had studied dozens of species' pre-battle rituals. The Norgadal consumed the flesh of their previous enemies, a practice that was both horrifying and tactically sound, given their ability to absorb genetic information through digestion. The Krill performed their blood feather ceremony, marking themselves with their own vital fluids to show their willingness to bleed. His own people, the Mathros, engaged in the clicking, a synchronized percussion of mandibles that unified the hive mind and prepared warriors for coordinated assault. But this was something else entirely. "It is a courage ritual," Gralmos concluded, watching as a human female with dark hair carefully measured portions of the dark powder with meticulous precision. "They are preparing themselves psychologically for conflict. The consumption of the aromatic substance must trigger biological responses that enhance their combat readiness. Sir, our chemical scanners are detecting trace amounts of a compound called caffeine in the steam, reported the sensor technician. It appears to be a mild stimulant affecting their central nervous system. A stimulant? Of course. Gralmos felt a mixture of emotions that his species didn't have specific words for, but roughly translated to impressed yet concerned with notes of professional respect. These humans, knowing they were facing impossible odds, were chemically enhancing themselves for battle. It was primitive, certainly, but there was something admirable about a species that needed to artificially induce courage and still showed up to fight. How dependent are they on this substance? Gralmos asked. Unknown, sir, but the ritual appears to be important to them. Multiple crew members are participating, and they are treating the preparation with significant care. On the screen, Captain Donovan accepted a steaming container from another crew member, a female with hair pulled back severely from her face. She was speaking, and although the surveillance audio was poor quality, Gralmos's translator caught fragments. Finally, I've been useless without this. Don't know how you functioned before. Going to need at least 2 more before I can deal with... Gralmos's mandibles clicked thoughtfully. They needed multiple doses? This was either a species with impressive pain tolerance and a correspondingly powerful stimulant, or they were more desperate than he'd initially assessed. Either way, his respect for them had increased marginally. Very marginally. They were still hopelessly outgunned. Sir, incoming transmission from the human vessel, Threshnik announced. On screen. Captain Donovan reappeared, and Gralmos immediately noticed the change. The human was holding one of the containers of dark liquid, steam still rising from its surface. But more than that, his entire demeanor had shifted. He looked alert, focused, and somehow even more relaxed than before, if that was possible. The human took a deliberate sip from his container before speaking, his eyes closed briefly as if savoring the moment. "All right, Commander," Donovan said, setting the container down but keeping it within reach. "Let's talk about these territorial claims. I've got our filing records ready for your review, time-stamped and verified by 3 separate registry offices." Gralmos studied him carefully. "You seem more prepared than before." "Yeah, well," Donovan said, and there was definitely amusement in his voice now. "We needed to take care of something important first. You know how it is." Gralmos didn't know how it was, but he nodded slowly anyway. "Very well. Transmit your records." As the data began flowing to the inexorable mandate's computers, Gralmos watched the human captain. Donovan picked up his container again, took another sip, and actually sighed with what sounded like contentment. Behind him, other human crew members were visible, each one holding similar containers, each one displaying that same strange combination of alertness and relaxation. What kind of species was this? What kind of stimulant produced such contradictory effects? And more importantly, what would these humans be like in actual combat if they were this calm after consuming their courage beverage? For the first time in a very long while, Commander Gralmos felt something he hadn't experienced since his days as a young warrior fresh from the molting chambers. Uncertainty. And wasn't that just delightful? The neutral meeting station was a relic from the old conquered wars, a spinning wheel of metal and composite materials that orbited a dead moon at the edge of the Outer Marrow Nebula. It had been designed specifically for situations like this, disputes between armed parties who needed somewhere to argue without immediately killing each other. The walls were blast-proof. The environmental systems could accommodate 16 different atmospheric requirements, and there was absolutely nothing of value to destroy, which meant nobody got too upset if things went sideways. Gralmos arrived with an honor guard of 6 Emthros warriors, each one a veteran of at least 50 territorial disputes. They moved in perfect synchronization, mandibles clicking in the traditional cadence of the diplomatic approach, which was really just the war approach with slightly less murder. The humans arrived 3 minutes later. All 5 of them were carrying thermal containers. Gralmos watched through his compound eyes as Captain Donovan led his delegation into the meeting chamber, flanked by 4 crew members who moved with the kind of casual confidence that absolutely should not exist in people facing off against an apex predator species. The human captain nodded pleasantly, like they were meeting for a recreational gathering rather than a territorial negotiation that could easily end in violence. "Commander," Donovan said, raising his thermal container slightly in what Gralmos assumed was a greeting gesture. "Thanks for agreeing to meet." "This is standard protocol," Gralmos replied, settling his massive form into a reinforced seat. His guards took positions around the room with military precision. "We resolve what can be resolved with words before we move to other methods." "Practical," Donovan agreed, sitting across from him with absolutely no regard for proper defensive positioning. The other humans followed suit, each one placing their thermal containers on the table within easy reach. "I like that." The negotiations began with the expected exchange of documentation. Coalition filing timestamps versus human filing timestamps, registry office confirmations, bureaucratic minutiae that would bore most species into a coma. Gralmos presented his evidence methodically, each point building on the last, creating an unassailable argument for coalition primacy. The humans listened politely, occasionally taking sips from their containers. It was the sipping that bothered Gralmos. Every time he made a particularly strong point, every time he presented evidence that should have caused concern or distress, one of the humans would calmly raise their container to their lips, drink, and then respond with the kind of measured calm that suggested they were discussing the weather rather than territorial sovereignty. "That's a good point," the human female named Tatum said, after Gralmos presented evidence of coalition presence in the sector dating back 6 months. She took a long sip from her container, closed her eyes briefly, and then continued. "However, our initial survey probe arrived 8 months ago, which predates your presence by 2 months. We have the telemetry data if you'd like to review it." She slid a data chip across the table, her movements unhurried, her expression pleasant. Behind her, another human. An engineer named Rhonda, if Gralmos recalled correctly, was adding something to her container from a small packet. The thermal sensors registered the liquid heating slightly. They were reheating the courage elixir, in the middle of negotiations. "You seem remarkably composed for a species facing overwhelming military disadvantage," Gralmos observed, deciding to shift tactics. Sometimes direct confrontation revealed more than careful diplomacy. Donovan smiled, an expression that showed far too many flat teeth to be entirely friendly. "Should we be panicking, Commander? Would that help the situation?" "Most species display appropriate concern when outmatched." "Sure, but we're not most species," Tatum interjected, taking another sip. "Besides, we've reviewed your fleet composition. 5 warships, impressive firepower, definitely a concern, but our records show you prefer overwhelming force to minimize casualties on both sides, which means you're not actually interested in a fight, if you can avoid it." Gralmos felt his auxiliary arms twitch. The human was correct, but she shouldn't have been able to deduce that from public records. Either their intelligence gathering was better than anticipated, or they were very good at reading tactical psychology. Neither option was comforting. "We are prepared to fight if necessary," he stated firmly. "Of course you are," Donovan said agreeably. So are we. But let's look at the actual facts here. Our filing predates yours. Our survey data confirms presence before your claim. And honestly, this nebula is big enough that we could probably both work different sections without ever bumping into each other. The coalition does not share territorial claims. Neither do humans, generally, Donovan replied, lifting his container. But we're practical people, Commander. Everything's negotiable. There was something about the way he said it, the complete absence of posturing or aggression, that unsettled Gralmoss more than any threat could have. These humans were treating this like a business transaction. No honor declarations, no ritual challenges, just calm, rational discussion while consuming their strange beverage. I must ask, Gralmoss said, gesturing toward the containers with one blade-tipped hand. What is that substance you continue to consume? Donovan glanced at his container, then back at Gralmoss with what might have been surprise. This? It's coffee. Did you want some? We brought extra. Coffee. The word translated oddly, carrying connotations of warmth, alertness, and social bonding. Your courage beverage, Gralmoss clarified. There was a moment of absolute silence. Then the human named Rhonda made a choking sound that might have been suppressed laughter. Tatum's expression went carefully neutral in the way that suggested she was fighting very hard not to react. Donovan's eyes widened slightly, and then he did something Gralmoss hadn't expected. He smiled. Wider this time, genuine amusement crinkling the corners of his eyes. Our courage beverage, Donovan repeated slowly, as if tasting the words. Sure. Yeah, that's one way to describe coffee. You consume it before potential combat situations, Gralmoss observed. It contains a stimulant that affects your neural processes. This is clearly a preparation ritual. Oh, it's definitely a ritual, Tatum said, and there was something dancing in her eyes that Gralmoss couldn't quite identify. We absolutely cannot function without it. Yeah, I'd be useless right now if I hadn't had my morning coffee, Rhonda added, her tone completely serious, despite the weird tension in the room. Donovan stood, picking up a spare thermal container from the carrying case one of his crew had brought. Commander, as a gesture of diplomatic goodwill, I'd like to offer you some of our, courage beverage to share in the ritual of negotiation. Gralmoss studied the offered container. This was unexpected. Among his own people, sharing pre-battle preparations was a sign of profound respect, acknowledging another warrior as equal. Was this human extending that courtesy? Or was this some kind of tactical ploy, offering a substance that might impair Mthros physiology? His translator chimed softly, providing linguistic context. The human phrase, gesture of goodwill, carried connotations of peace offering, diplomatic courtesy, and cultural exchange. There was no indication of deception in Donovan's biometric readings, no elevation in stress hormones or cardiovascular irregularity. Very well, Gralmoss said, accepting the container with one of his secondary hands. I will partake of your warrior's drink. The humans exchanged glances, and Gralmoss could have sworn that Rhonda was biting her lip to keep from making a sound. What was that about? He raised the container to his mandibles, modified drinking appendages allowing him to sample liquids without compromising his natural weaponry. The dark liquid touched his taste receptors, and Gralmoss experienced something he would later describe in his report as aggressively unpleasant. Bitter. Incredibly bitter, with notes of burnt plant matter and a chemical astringency that made his sensory organs recoil. This was medicinal. It had to be. No species would consume something this harsh unless it provided significant tactical benefits. It is quite potent, Gralmoss managed, setting the container down with more force than intended. Yeah, we make it strong, Donovan agreed, his smile never wavering. Can't function without our morning coffee. Absolutely essential. Life or death situation, really. I see, Gralmoss said slowly, reassessing everything he thought he knew about humans. They consumed this willingly? Multiple times per day? The dedication required for that kind of chemical dependency spoke to either impressive discipline or desperate necessity. Either way, it made them more dangerous than he'd initially calculated. The negotiations collapsed 3 hours later, not with violence or dramatic pronouncements, but with the kind of bureaucratic impasse that made Gralmoss want to slam his blade hands into something structural. The humans had legitimate filing documentation, time-stamped and verified. The coalition had equally legitimate claims, supported by different registry offices using different temporal standards. It was, in the most technical and annoying sense, a genuine dispute that couldn't be resolved through paperwork alone. We require 6 rotations to consult with Coalition High Command, Gralmoss announced, standing to his full height. At that time, we will present our final position. If diplomatic resolution remains impossible, we will proceed with military enforcement of our claim. Donovan nodded, seemingly unbothered by the thinly veiled threat of orbital bombardment. That's fair. We'll need to consult with our command structure, too. See you in 6 rotations, Commander. The human delegation filed out, each one still carrying their thermal containers, still displaying that same infuriating calm. Gralmoss watched them go, his compound eyes tracking their movements, analyzing their gait, their posture, their complete lack of appropriate concern. Sir, Threshnik said quietly once the humans had departed, they are either incredibly brave or incredibly foolish. Or incredibly dependent on chemical enhancement, Gralmoss replied. Inform Coalition Command. I want a full tactical analysis of human combat capabilities, and I want to know everything about this coffee substance. If it truly provides the psychological fortification they display, we need to understand its limitations. Over the next rotation, as the inexorable mandate held position at the edge of the nebula, Coalition intelligence went to work. What they discovered was simultaneously fascinating and deeply concerning. It consumed coffee constantly. Not just before combat, not just during high-stress situations, but multiple times throughout their daily cycles. Some consumed it upon waking, before they had even engaged in any meaningful activity. Others drank it socially, during recreational periods, while engaging in low-stress tasks that required no chemical courage whatsoever. It makes no sense, Threshnik reported during the tactical briefing. Our analysis suggests that continuous use of a stimulant would lead to dependency, requiring ever-increasing doses to achieve the same effect. Yet human medical literature indicates this is considered normal behavior. Gralmoss studied the data streaming across his tactical display. Human coffee consumption statistics, medical studies on caffeine tolerance, cultural documentation of something called coffee culture that seemed to permeate every aspect of their civilization. There were establishments on Earth whose sole purpose was dispensing this substance. Humans had entire economic systems built around its production and distribution. They have weaponized dependency, one of the coalition's strategic analysts concluded, a krill named Mraktesh, whose species understood chemical warfare better than most. They have made themselves reliant on a performance-enhancing compound and normalized it across their entire culture. This suggests either remarkable dedication to maintaining combat readiness or profound psychological weakness that requires constant pharmaceutical support. Which do you assess as more likely? Gralmoss asked. Mraktesh's feathers ruffled in what his species considered a shrug. The data is contradictory. Humans function adequately without the substance, but self-report significantly decreased performance. They describe symptoms of withdrawal that include irritability, decreased focus, and physical discomfort. Yet they voluntarily maintain this dependency. Perhaps, Gralmos mused, watching footage of the human vessel through long-range scanners, they are naturally a passive species who discovered they needed enhancement to compete in a hostile galaxy. The courage beverage allows them to function despite their biological limitations. It was a working theory anyway, better than admitting he had no idea what he was dealing with. Meanwhile, aboard the Wandering Oak, Captain Donovan was having the time of his life. "You should have seen his face when he tasted it," he said, laughing hard enough that he nearly spilled his currant cup. "Thought he was going to drop the container right there." Tatum grinned from her position at the navigation console, cradling her own mug. "I genuinely cannot believe they think coffee is a courage drug. How did we end up in this situation?" "Because you lot made a whole production out of the brewing process," Rhonda said, though she was smiling too. "Standing there with your eyes closed, inhaling the aroma like it's some sacred ritual. I mean, it kind of is, but not the way they think." "Should we tell them?" asked Dmitri, the weapons officer, a man built like a cargo hauler with a surprisingly gentle demeanor. "Seems kind of unfair to let them keep thinking we're chemically enhanced super warriors." "Absolutely not," Donovan said firmly. "First of all, it's hilarious. Second, it might actually give us a tactical advantage. They're clearly overthinking this entire situation, which means they're distracted and uncertain. Third, and most importantly, it's really, really hilarious." "Captain, we've received a priority transmission from Earth Command," announced Miko from the communications station. The young officer still looked nervous, despite 3 cups of coffee and 6 hours to calm down. "They're asking for a situation update." Donovan sobered slightly. "What did you tell them?" "That we're in a territorial dispute with the Galactic Apex Coalition. Negotiations are ongoing, and we're awaiting their guidance on how to proceed." "Good. Send them all our documentation. Let them know we're prepared to defend our claim if necessary, but we're hoping for a diplomatic resolution." Donovan paused, considering. "Also mention that the coalition commander seems to respect our, pre-negotiation rituals." "Should I mention the coffee thing, sir?" "Absolutely mention the coffee thing. Command is going to lose their minds." What Donovan didn't know was that Earth Command was already mobilizing. The Outer Marrow Nebula wasn't just valuable, it was strategically positioned and resource-rich enough to justify significant investment. When the territorial claim had been filed 8 months ago, it had been the opening move in humanity's expansion into this sector. They weren't about to let it go without a fight. 3 rotations later, Gralmos received intelligence that made his mandibles click in agitation. "A human fleet has entered the outer system," Threshnik reported. "Sensors detect approximately 300 vessels." 300. Gralmos felt his combat instincts surge. This was it, then. The humans were escalating to military confrontation. "Battle formation, prepare all weapons. If they—" "Sir," Threshnik interrupted, his tone odd. "These are not warships. They appear to be civilian vessels, colony transports, cargo haulers, construction equipment. We're detecting families, Commander. Human offspring." Gralmos stared at the tactical display, his brain struggling to process this information. "They brought their young to a potential war zone?" "It appears so, sir. We're also detecting significant quantities of supplies. Prefabricated habitat modules, terraforming equipment, agricultural materials, and—" Threshnik paused, his mandibles going still. "Sir, One of the vessels is designated Coffee Supply Ship Number 9. Number 9, Gralmos repeated slowly. Meaning there are at least 8 others? Confirmed, sir. We're detecting 9 dedicated cargo vessels whose primary manifests list various forms of coffee products. Beans, ground powder, processing equipment, and something called espresso machines. Gralmos sat down, which was saying something given that Mithras rarely sat during tactical situations. The humans had brought industrial quantities of their courage beverage to a disputed territory where combat was a distinct possibility. This implied one of several things, none of them comforting. Either humans were so dependent on chemical enhancement that they required massive supply chains to maintain combat effectiveness, or they were so confident in their military superiority that they were already moving colonists into contested space, or, and this was the option that bothered Gralmos most, they genuinely didn't consider the coalition a serious enough threat to disrupt their colonization plans. "Open a channel to the human captain," he ordered. Donovan appeared on screen, and Gralmos noted immediately that the human was holding another container of coffee. Of course he was. "Commander," Donovan said pleasantly, "I'm guessing you've noticed our colony convoy?" "You brought civilians to a potential combat zone," Gralmos stated, trying to keep the confusion out of his voice. "Well, yeah," Donovan replied, taking a sip. "We filed our territorial claim 8 months ago. The colony mission has been in planning for 6 months. We're not going to disrupt hundreds of families and billions of credits worth of investment just because of a filing dispute. We're confident we can resolve this diplomatically. And if we cannot? If this escalates to military action?" Donovan's expression didn't change, but something in his eyes hardened. "Then we'll deal with that if it happens. But let's be honest, Commander. Neither of us actually wants that outcome. You've got a perfect record to maintain, and we've got colonists who just want to start building their new homes. There has to be a middle ground here. The coalition does not compromise on territorial claims." "Sure you do," Donovan said calmly. "You've got shared governance agreements with at least 3 other coalitions in different sectors. I looked it up. This doesn't have to be all or nothing." Gralmos felt something shift in his assessment of the situation. The human was right, though he hated admitting it. The coalition did have precedent for shared territorial arrangements, particularly in resource-rich zones where outright conquest would be more costly than cooperation. "You would accept a shared governance structure?" he asked carefully. "If it's equitable and gives both our peoples access to the nebula's resources?" "Sure. We're practical, Commander. We don't need to own everything. We just need enough space to grow." There was something deeply unsettling about negotiating with someone this reasonable. While they casually consumed a substance that you were increasingly convinced was either the most powerful psychological tool ever developed or just a popular beverage. Gralmos still wasn't sure which, and that uncertainty was becoming a tactical liability. "I will consult with Coalition Command," he said finally, "but I want to understand something first. Your people brought 9 ships full of coffee to this system. Why? What tactical purpose does such excessive supply serve?" Donovan blinked, and then that smile was back, the one that suggested he was perpetually amused by something Gralmos couldn't see. "Commander, you've tasted coffee. Could you imagine running a colony of 3,000 humans without an adequate supply?" Gralmos thought about the bitter, harsh liquid he'd forced himself to sample. If humans needed that to function, then no, he genuinely couldn't imagine trying to maintain social cohesion without it. They'd probably mutiny within a week. "Point taken," he conceded. "Stand by for further communication." As the channel closed, Threshnik leaned closer. "Sir, what are your orders?" Gralmos watched the human colony fleet on his display. Hundreds of ships full of families and supplies, and apparently enough coffee to keep an entire civilization chemically balanced for months. He thought about Captain Donovan's unshakable calm, about the way the humans had treated overwhelming military disadvantage like a minor scheduling conflict, about the fact that they'd brought their children to a war zone because they were that confident in either their abilities or their negotiation skills. "Contact Coalition High Command," he ordered. "Recommend we pursue the shared governance option, and send a request to our Xenopsychology Division. I want to know everything about human coffee culture, and I want to know it yesterday." "Yes, sir." Gralmos settled back into his command chair, his compound eyes still tracking the human fleet. Somewhere on one of those ships, families were probably drinking coffee right now, completely unconcerned about the 5 warships that could reduce their vessels to expanding clouds of debris. Either humans were the bravest species he'd ever encountered, or the most dangerously casual. He still wasn't sure which scared him more. The final confrontation, such as it was, happened exactly 6 rotations after the initial ultimatum. Gralmos assembled his fleet in standard intimidation formation, 5 warships arranged in a pattern that maximized visible firepower while maintaining optimal firing solutions. It was a formation that had convinced 63 other species to reconsider their life choices over the past 3,000 rotations. The humans responded by brewing coffee. Not metaphorically, literally. Coalition sensors detected the Wandering Oak's galley systems activating, water being heated to precise temperatures, the distinctive aromatic compounds of coffee preparation wafting through their recycled atmosphere. It was 9 in the morning, ship time, and apparently the humans had priorities. "They are performing the ritual again," Threshnik observed, his mandibles clicking with what might have been respect or bewilderment. Possibly both. "Of course they are," Gralmos muttered, watching his tactical display. The human colony fleet hung in space behind the Wandering Oak like a promise or a threat, depending on how you looked at it. 300 civilian vessels, completely vulnerable, utterly calm. "Open a channel. Let us resolve this." Donovan appeared on screen, thermal container already in hand. Behind him, Tatum and the rest of his bridge crew were similarly equipped. They looked like they were settling in for a pleasant discussion about recreational activities, not a potential space battle. "Commander," Donovan said, raising his container in that same greeting gesture. "Good timing. We just finished brewing a fresh pot." "I have consulted with Coalition High Command," Gralmos announced, deciding to ignore the coffee comment entirely. "We are prepared to offer terms. We're listening." Shared. Territorial governance. The Coalition maintains primary mining rights to the northern quadrants of the nebula. Humans receive primary development rights to the southern and eastern quadrants. A neutral administrative zone will be established for dispute resolution. Both parties agree to mutual defense protocols and resource-sharing arrangements. Gralmos waited for the counter-arguments, the negotiations, the inevitable human tendency to find something wrong with a perfectly reasonable compromise. Instead, Donovan took a long sip of his coffee, closed his eyes briefly in that weird ritual appreciation, and then nodded. "That works. We'll need to review the specific quadrant boundaries and resource allocation percentages, but the framework is solid. I'll have our legal team draft a formal agreement for review." That was it? No posturing, no demands for more favorable terms, just immediate acceptance of a fair arrangement? Gralmos felt his understanding of human psychology shift again. like trying to grip something that kept changing shape. "You agree to these terms without negotiation?" he asked, genuinely confused. "Why wouldn't we?" Donovan replied. "You're offering us access to the resources we need, recognition of our territorial claim, and a framework for peaceful coexistence. That's exactly what we wanted. Sure, we could spend 3 days arguing over percentage points and boundary definitions, but honestly, Commander, I'd rather just get this settled so everyone can get to work." Most species attempt to maximize their advantage in negotiations. Most species waste a lot of time on principle, when practical solutions are sitting right in front of them, Tatum interjected, her tone carrying the kind of dry wit that Gralmoss was beginning to recognize as distinctly human. "We're not most species." No, Gralmoss thought. They definitely were not. "Very well," he said, still waiting for the other appendage to drop. "We will transmit formal documentation within the hour. I assume you will begin colony operations immediately?" "Probably this afternoon," Donovan confirmed. "Got a lot of eager families who've been cooped up in those transports for 3 months. They're ready to start building." "And the coffee supply ships?" Donovan's expression flickered with something, amusement dancing in his eyes again. "Essential infrastructure, Commander. Can't run a colony without proper supplies." Gralmoss decided it was time. He'd been authorized by Coalition Command to gather direct intelligence on human coffee culture, and there was only one way to get real answers. "Captain, I must ask you something directly. This coffee substance, is it truly a courage beverage? A chemical preparation for combat?" The silence that followed was profound. On the human bridge, every crew member had gone completely still, their expressions frozen in that peculiar way that suggested they were fighting very hard not to react. Donovan's eyes widened, his mouth opening slightly, and then he did something Gralmoss had never seen a human do during a formal military communication. He laughed. Not a polite chuckle or a restrained expression of amusement, but a full, genuine laugh that shook his shoulders and made him set down his coffee container before he spilled it. Behind him, Tatum had turned away from the screen, her hand pressed over her mouth. Rhonda was making a sound like choking. Even young Miko, who'd been nervous for 6 straight rotations, was grinning. "Commander," Donovan managed after a moment, wiping at his eyes, "I'm so sorry. I've been waiting to see how long it would take for you to ask directly. Coffee isn't a courage drug. It's just coffee, a popular beverage. We drink it because we like it, and because the caffeine helps us wake up in the morning." Gralmoss felt several of his auxiliary thought processes crash simultaneously. "But you said you cannot function without it." "Yeah, we're a little grumpy and unfocused before coffee. But that's not because we need chemical courage. It's because we're tired, and caffeine helps with alertness. That's it. There's no ritual preparation for battle, no psychological enhancement for combat. We were literally just making our morning coffee. The elaborate preparation process is just because good coffee requires specific temperatures and timing. We're particular about our beverages, Commander. It's a cultural thing. The multiple supply ships are because we drink a lot of coffee, like a truly unreasonable amount. But it's not military equipment, it's just something we enjoy." Gralmoss sat very still, processing this information. His entire tactical assessment had been based on the assumption that humans required chemical enhancement to maintain their psychological composure, that their unnatural calm under pressure was artificially induced, that their casual attitude toward overwhelming military disadvantage was pharmacologically supported. But if coffee was just a beverage, just something they liked, then that meant— "You were genuinely that calm during our negotiations," he said slowly. without chemical assistance. Facing 5 warships with a crew of 32, you were simply unbothered. I mean, we were definitely aware of the situation, Donovan said, his amusement fading into something more serious. But panicking wasn't going to help anything. We had legitimate claims, reasonable arguments, and confidence that you were a rational commander who would prefer negotiation to unnecessary violence. Getting worked up about it seemed counterproductive. And the colony fleet? Bringing civilians to a potential war zone? We were confident in our position. And if we'd been wrong, we had evacuation protocols ready. But we didn't think we were wrong. Threshnik leaned close to Gralmoss, his voice sub-vocalized so the humans couldn't hear. Sir, if their composure is natural, if they maintain that psychological stability without enhancement, then they are significantly more dangerous than we assessed. He was right. A species that could face existential threats with genuine calm, that could negotiate under extreme pressure without chemical support, that could risk their families on the strength of their convictions without artificial courage, was either remarkably foolish or remarkably formidable. Gralmoss was increasingly convinced it was the latter. I see, he said finally. Then I must ask, Captain, why did you allow us to continue believing coffee was a courage beverage? You must have realized our misunderstanding. Donovan's smile returned, smaller this time, but no less genuine. Honestly? Because it was funny. And because sometimes, Commander, letting people underestimate you or misunderstand you can be just as useful as demonstrating strength. You spent 6 rotations analyzing coffee instead of analyzing our actual tactical capabilities. That's not nothing. Gralmoss felt something that his species didn't have a word for, but humans would have called grudging respect mixed with mild irritation. These soft-skinned, naturally vulnerable creatures had accidentally psychologically maneuvered the Galactic Apex Coalition through nothing more than a beverage preference and a willingness to let the misunderstanding play out. You are devious, he observed. We're practical, Donovan corrected, and now we're neighbors. So how about, as a gesture of genuine goodwill this time, I send over some actual good coffee and teach your crew how to brew it properly. That way it won't taste like punishment next time you try it. Despite himself, despite the tactical embarrassment, despite everything, Gralmoss clicked his mandibles in what might have been laughter. Very well, Captain. I accept your offer. Perhaps humans and the Coalition have more to learn from each other than we initially assessed. I think we're going to get along just fine, Commander. As the channel closed and the formal treaty process began, Gralmoss watched the human colony fleet start to disperse toward their designated territories. Families beginning new lives, completely unbothered by the warships still holding position nearby. Confident, calm, and apparently running on nothing more than hot bean water and natural audacity. The galaxy, Gralmoss reflected, had just gotten significantly more interesting. And somewhere on the wandering oak, Captain Donovan poured himself another cup of coffee, smiled at his crew, and said something that would have terrified Coalition Command if they'd been listening. Same time tomorrow?